Hello, Silverpaw Reads here, and I'm going to be reading Chapter 5 of Spike. Apologize if there's any stuttering or anything. I've went through and I've read the chapter before, and there's a few mistakes, and sometimes when there's a mistake in the writing, it totally just completely screws me up, or sometimes I'll get a little bit click happy with my mouse or something, and I'll click and make the story smaller, and I have to refine my place. So I apologize. I'll try to keep it at a minimum, but if anything does, weird happen, I apologize. Where were you today? I didn't see you at school. Were you sick? Yeah, my stomach wasn't feeling too good, so I decided to stay at home. What happened to your face? Oh, it's nothing. I just ran into a tree last night. It was kind of dark. I couldn't see it. Sam didn't ask any more questions. He knew Spike was lying, but he wasn't sure he wanted to know the truth, so he let Spike think he believed him. Spike carefully began, "Can I come in now?" The sudden flow of questions had reached him the very second Sam had opened the door for him, not even giving him a chance to enter the house. "Oh, right, sure. Sorry," Sam said, realizing how rude he'd been, but added a short laugh just to show he'd meant no harm by it. It was a lovely Monday afternoon, a cloudy but still incredibly warm one. Spike followed Sam out into the backyard where Saunders and Terence sat on their lawn chairs talking about everything and nothing. Spike didn't know much about Terence. All he knew was that he was Sam's godfather and Saunders' best friend, and that he'd pay them a visit every once in a while. Spike nodded politely to Terence, who reached up his hand and greeted Spike with a loud, "Yo, Schaefer! Good to see you, man." Hippies, Spike thought to himself and formed a wry smile. He liked Terence, even though he was a bit shy of him, and didn't want to approach him because he was gay. Spike was a little skeptical of gay people. He couldn't really tell if he hated them or not, but something frightened him at the thought of a guy who voluntarily sleeping with another male. He figured maybe it was because he suspected that Chuck was gay, and he feared that's what other homosexuals were like. He'd even sometimes questioned whether he himself could be gay, but he concluded that he wasn't. At least he didn't want to be one. But homosexual or not, Terence was one of the coolest people Spike had ever met, besides Saunders, of course. Terence was as tall as Saunders, wore black t-shirts, and wore jeans with holes on the knees. He obviously hadn't quite abandoned the way of dressing from back in the days when he and Saunders were hippies. But the thing Spike found the coolest about him was the long white dreadlocks that made his head look like a mop, and almost completely hid his face. In fact, Spike had no idea what Terence's eyes looked like, because it was impossible to spot them behind the thick dreads. "Have a beer, kids," Terence joked just to make Saunders nervous. "Dumbass." Saunders chuckled and gently kicked Terence's leg. The two of them were like brothers, always calling each other's names and competing about random nonsensical stuff. Saunders had no problem at all with Terence being gay. He accepted it, being the tolerant person he was. Terence had just had to swear that he wouldn't fall for Saunders and that they'd kept on being best friends. And Terence wasn't your stereotypical homosexual either. There was nothing about him at all that revealed his sexuality, so whenever he told people, it always came as a shock. His boyfriend, however, was very feminine, but also a great guy to hang out with. Gregory was his name, and also incredibly tall. Tall, dark, and very handsome. Spike had never met Gregory, but he'd heard Sam talk about him. He had nothing but positive things to say about Greg, but still, Spike didn't really feel like he wanted to meet him. Terence took another sip of his drink, which wasn't beer at all, but orange juice. Just like Saunders, he only drank alcohol when he was going out with friends, and he made sure he never got wasted. Those days were long past. They weren't teenagers anymore. "You guys thirsty?" Saunders asked. "It's damn hot outside, isn't it? Here, come sit down." Terry, will you go get some chairs?" "Sir, yes, sir," Terence said and stood up like a soldier. He knew just how much Saunders hated the army and loved to joke about it. "Private Torrett, reporting for duty," he said, and walked inside to get some chairs. Saunders just laughed and called him an idiot. Another cool thing about Terence, at least in Spike's opinion, was his name. Terence Nicodemus Torrent, alias Terry Torrent, or TNT for short. Terence soon came back with a couple of chairs for Sam and Spike, and then Saunders gave them each their glass. It was nice sitting out in the garden together with Sam and his silly father and uncle. Spike felt so welcome in the family. Saunders treated him like a son, Sam treated him like a brother, and even his relatives treated him like part of the family. No wonder Spike spent almost every afternoon at Sam's house. It's the only place he knew where people treated him nicely. "Mrs. Griffin burst into tears again today," Sam suddenly said to Spike. Spike looked at him and chuckled. "Marco was being an ass again, huh?" "Sure was. I've already lost count on how many times he's made her cry," Sam laughed. "Gotta admit, though, even though Marco's a total dick, he's one of the funniest guys in class." "Funny?" Spike frowned. "He's plain rude, that's what he is." "Yeah, but you should have heard him," Sam said and quoted what Marco had told the teacher. "You're so fat you get claustrophobia at the airport," he laughed. Spike couldn't help giggle about it, even though he hated Marco. Marco was a kid in Sam's class who'd been after Spike, bullying him ever since 5th grade, but he also was a great coward and never seen without his gang, whose favorite hobby was to pick fights with Spike and getting him sent to the principal's office. Marco was just another reason for Spike to hate and avoid going to school. The other reasons were that he found it hard to pay attention and to read because of his reading difficulties. What he hated most about school was all the people, especially the teachers. Your math teacher left you a note, though, Sam continued after he'd finished laughing. He gave it to me, but I lost it. I still remember what it said, though. You read my notes? Well, yeah, I figured you'd be okay with it, Sam said innocently. I don't mind, Spike shrugged. So what's the message? Sam cleared his throat. Spike Schaefer, I've scheduled for you to take your missing math test on Tuesday. Also, you need to show me that you've done your homework or your grades will start dropping dramatically. Please show up at school tomorrow morning. Derek. Oh, fuck the math test. And it's tomorrow! What are you worried about? Aren't you great at math? Yeah, I'm fucking awesome, Spike said sarcastically. Damn, what am I gonna do? I don't even have the books. I let you borrow mine, but I forgot to bring them home, Spike said, apologizing. Their little conversation was interrupted by Saunders, who offered them something to drink. The boys reached out their glasses, and Saunders filled them with soda. Spike thanked him politely. I hate tests, Spike murmured to Sam. Still, you always score fairly well on them, Sam pointed out. I don't think you have any reason to be nervous about tomorrow. And my grades are going to drop. I thought you didn't care about your grades. Oh, I don't. It's just that I'm sick of the teachers nagging at me because of those damn grades like it was the single most important thing in life. Your art teacher isn't nagging you, though, is she? Well, my art teacher hates me. She says my drawings are horrid and always ends up curling them into little balls of paper before she goes off yelling at me that I have to come up with a decent product or I'll fail her class. That bitch. Sam sighed. You should have been in my class. Our teachers are always nicer. Their class has got Marco. Oh, good point. They both took a large sip of their drinks before they leaned back in their chairs and looked out at the lush garden. Spike didn't want to talk more about school. He'd much rather just forget about its whole existence and instead enjoy this hot summer day, which reminded him that it was now just a matter of weeks before the summer holidays. He knew Sam looked forward to it. There was hardly a day now where he didn't mention it. Spike, however, didn't know whether to be excited or not. Summer holidays meant, on the one hand, that he'd have plenty of time to hang out with Sam. Plus, there'd be no more worries about getting late for school, doing homework, tests, exams, and so on. The holidays meant complete freedom from all of that. But on the other hand, not having a school to go to meant that he'd have to stay home in the morning and probably the whole day sometimes too. He wouldn't have any excuse to leave the house other than meeting Sam. Spike hadn't told Chuck about Sam not wanting his friend to get into trouble. He was running out of excuses to leave the house, so whatever he did, he'd probably have less time to spend with Sam and more time with Chuck. Spike shuddered at the thought. Sam picked up a dandelion and started plucking its petals one by one. They fell slowly to the ground and landed on his bare feet. Spike hadn't noticed before now that Sam wasn't wearing any shoes or socks, and he looked at Saunders and Terence and he noticed they were both wearing sandals. Spike looked at his own feet. He had left his sneakers in the entrance of the house, not to make the floor dirty, and so on his feet were now just his black socks. He didn't dare take them off. Not that his feet were ugly or smelly or anything, it was just that taking one's socks off was also a way of undressing, and even though his feet were very warm, he was too shy to even take a single sock off. Come to think of it, his entire body was pretty warm now, especially his legs, which were covered by a long pair of dark, baggy jeans, while his torso was hidden under a black, oversized t-shirt. All of his clothes were oversized and baggy, not because he wanted to be that way, but because his uncle didn't want to buy him new ones that often, so he bought them big so Spike could have them until he outgrew them. Sam was wearing a red t-shirt with a star on it, and his clothes weren't oversized at all. The t-shirt, in fact, looked like it was starting to get too small for him, or maybe it was just form-fitting. Spike couldn't tell. Sam's shorts, however, reached to right above his knees and were fairly baggy. Spike carefully glanced over at Saunders to see how summer-dressed he was, and noticed he was also wearing jeans, but they were light blue and with the legs rolled up so his shins were showing. And he was still wearing a t-shirt, tartan this time, completely unbuttoned. Spike just knew that soon one of them was going to ask, "Aren't you warm, kid?" or something along those lines. People always did that to people who dressed in black in the summer. Sam picked up another dandelion and repeated what he'd done to the previous one. "What are you doing?" Spike asked. Sam looked at him and didn't quite understand. "What's with the flowers?" Spike continued. "Oh, that, nothing. I'm just picking up petals, or off petals," he said. "Looks more to me like you're doing the loves me not thing." "I am not," Sam said, adding a nervous giggle. Who should I be in love with?" "Oh, I don't know." Spike shrugged, and so they didn't talk more about the flower. Instead, they idly started to eavesdrop on the adults. They were talking about old times. Sam noticed that that Jam was being mentioned. Jam, or Jimmy, was the last member of the trio. He left them when he found out Terence was gay. Still, Saunders and Terence counted him as part of their little group, and there was no hard feelings even though he'd left. That was pretty much all Sam knew about this Jam character. He had heard a few hilarious stories from his father about the things they do, but he knew that very little about this Jam as a person, other than he was obviously homophobic. They just sat there in the afternoon sun, drinking soda and talking about random things for several hours. Spike quite enjoyed it. He felt like he belonged and that he meant a lot, and that meant a lot to him. Sam eventually brought out a deck of cards and tried to teach Spike how to play poker, using grapes and flower petals as money. Soon, when Spike had learnt the rules, Terence and Saunders decided to join in, so they sat on the front porch floor and played poker until the sun started to set. Spike recalled both smiling and laughing that evening. He had the time of his life. "Are you sure you have to go now?" Sam asked a little down. "Yeah, I promised I wouldn't be late," Spike said. "Okay, then," Sam said and sighed. "Well, I'll see you at school tomorrow, won't I?" "Yeah, I'll be there," Spike said, got his shoes and waved Sam goodbye before he left. Sam walked to the kitchen where his father was doing the dishes. "Dad, where's Uncle Terry?" he asked. Out in the garden, I think. Why?" "Oh, nothing," Sam said and started walking towards the back door leading out to the garden. "Tell him to come help me with the dishes when he's done," Saunders called after his son. "Will do," Sam called back. He found Terence standing on the porch smoking and walked over to him. "Hey, Sam." Terence smiled and ruffled Sam's hair. "Hi, Uncle Terry," Sam smiled, and his smile faded as he recalled why he'd come out there in the first place. "Terry," he begun, "can I ask you something?" "Sure, go ahead," Terence said, took a deep puff of his cigarette before he put it out on the ashtray standing on the banister. Sam hesitated a bit before he asked his questions. "Uncle, where can people buy whips?" Behind the dreadlocks, Terence's eyes widened. "Whips?" he repeated. "Why are you asking me that?" "Well, I don't know. I just figured since you live downtown, then you might know some shops that sell whips," Sam said innocently. "Oh, okay," Terence said. "But why whips? What do you need a whip for?" "Well, I don't need one. I'm just curious about where people can get one, that's all." Terence had to think about it for a while, and then he told Sam what he knew, that you could either get a cheap whips from fetish stores, or you could probably get a horse whip at a pet store, or the likes, but that whips weren't something you could just go and get for your average convenience store. "I see," Sam said and got thoughtful. Then he decided to use this opportunity to ask another question. "How hard would you have to hit with the whip to cause scars?" Terence chuckled a little and shook his head. "Sam, where are all these weird questions coming from all of a sudden? Is this some sort of school assignment about slavery you're asking me about?" "No, I'm just curious," Sam repeated. Terence sighed deeply and scratched the back of his head. "Well, I don't know, but I guess you'll have to hit pretty hard, and you'll probably need a special whip without a blunt end if you were to cut through the skin. Maybe a person could get a whip like that from an antique shop. I'm not sure, but I would guess such whips would be pretty difficult to get, unless, of course, you somehow managed to make one yourself. But I don't know. I don't think I'm the right person to ask about such." Terence shrugged and smiled, apologizing to Sam. "Did that answer some of your questions?" "Yeah, thanks," Sam said. By the way, Dad wants you to come to the kitchen." "Tell him I'd be right there," Terence said, and picked up his cell phone from his pocket. "I just gotta give Greg a call." "All right," Sam said and walked back inside. "Dad," he called out when he reached the open entrance to the kitchen. "Terence, he's just gonna make a call and he'll come and help you. I'll be in my room." "Okay," Saunders called back. "Supper's at 10. Is Terry staying for supper?" "No, I think he'll drive home soon." "Oh, let me know when he leaves," Sam said, so he went to his room. He lay down on the bed with his arms crossed behind his back, looking up at the ceiling. He thought about what Terence had told him and how was now absolutely positive that Spike's scars would have been caused by a whip, especially now that it knew it was possible for ordinary people to get one. He started to think of it, Spike getting whipped by his very own uncle. He'd have to ask him again how he'd got them. Part of him hoped Spike would say they were just stretch marks or that he had had some sort of back surgery, but those marks didn't look like either of those things. They had to be whip marks. Sam lay thinking real hard about this, then he wondered whether he should tell his dad about what he'd seen or not. He pictured the scenario, Sam telling his father that Spike was being abused. His father would probably first have told Sam not to lie about such things. Then he'd very quickly have to take him seriously. Knowing his son never lied to him, and knowing the truth, he'd be furious and would probably have made Spike tell him where he lived. Then most likely have gone up there and beaten the crap out of Spike's uncle. Sam jerked a little smile. He imagined his father beats up Spike's abusive uncle and had to admit to himself that he quite enjoyed watching it. But what would have happened next? The police would find out about it somehow. They'd send his father off to jail, and Sam would have to live with his mother, and Spike would be sent to an orphanage, and he'd heard bad rumors about orphanages. He couldn't let that happen. Besides, when Spike had told Sam when they were kids that his uncle hit him, he'd made Sam promise not to tell anyone. And even though this was serious, Sam just couldn't make himself break a promise. He had to talk to Spike first, convince him that they had to do something about it. Something? But what? What could two youngsters do about such a thing? Who would believe them? Well, they'd believe us if we showed them his scars, Sam thought to himself, but who were they? The police? He didn't trust the police, and he couldn't bring them over to their house because of what his father did for a living. If they discovered the plants in his basement, he'd be done for. And this was just too much for Sam. He shook his head heavily and tried to think of something else. All this musing was causing his head to ache, and the thought of abuse made him depressed. But he had to talk to Spike soon again about this. One day, maybe not tomorrow, but one day he'd make him talk. Sam rolled over onto his side and closed his eyes before trying to take a short nap, exhausted by all the serious thinking, and it didn't take long before he fell into a deep sleep. "Hey, Pete." Saunders turned his head and looked at Terence, who'd finally entered the kitchen. "Yeah, what?" he asked, and just kept on washing up. "Your kid just asked me the strangest question." "How babies are made?" Saunders joked. "Hilarious," Terence said sarcastic. "No, he asked me a whole lot of questions about whips." "Whips? What's so strange about that?" "A 13-year-old comes asking, 'Hey, uncle, where can I buy whips?' Shouldn't that worry you?" "No, he's probably just curious. He asked me all sorts of weird questions, like, 'Dad, is it a sign of paranoia or egoism when you think everyone's staring at you?' Or, 'How were squids born?' Or, 'Is God an alien?' That's just a few of them. Don't worry." Terence cleared his throat and quoted, "Uncle, how hard would you have to hit with a whip to cause scars?" Saunders looked at him. "I think the kid knows something, Peter," Terence said grave. "What do you mean?" "Did you see that bruise on Spike's face today? What if there's something about him Sam's not telling?" Saunders got thoughtful. "I won't deny that I've been a bit worried about Spike. Today's not the first time he's shown up with a bruise on an unreliable excuse. But how can I be sure?" "Have you ever talked to him, just the two of you?" Terence asked. "I've been thinking of doing it, but I doubt he'll tell me anything." "Yeah, well, it's worth a shot, you know," Terence said. "What if there really is something going on in that house, and we're just sitting here twiddling thumbs pretending we don't know anything?" I know, but I can't be too sure until I've talked to him or seen some sort of evidence, you know? What if he's just a clumsy person who falls downstairs, runs into walls and trees, hits himself trying to open a carton of juice? People do that." "You don't even believe yourself, Saunders. You don't even believe that yourself, Saunders." Saunders sighed. "I just can't stand the thought of someone hurting him. He's been around for so many years. I've watched him grow. He's like a son to me, Terence." "I know, but if he means that much to you, then the least thing you can do is have a talk with him to make sure he's all right." "Yeah," Saunders said and folded his arms, leaning towards the counter. "Fine, I'll talk to him one day when the time's right." "Attaboy, Saunders," Terence said and gave him a pat on the back. "Well, I've got to go now. I'll call you later this week and drop by with the money." "Yeah, I'll have some stash ready for you by then. See ya." He then suddenly recalled his promise to Sam. "Oh, wait, I told Sam I'd let him know when you left." "Okay, I'll wait out in the entrance." Saunders walked out of the kitchen into the hall and into Sam's room, only to find him sound asleep. He smiled fatherly at the sight, and he picked up the blankets from the chair next to the door, folded it out, and carefully laid it over Sam. Then he silently left the room and let the boy sleep. He walked back to the hall, saying goodbye to Terence before he went to the living room, deciding to sit down and read some comics. He tried to focus on reading, but quickly discovered that all he could do was worry about Spike. "I'll talk to him," Saunders thought, "but first, I'll have a serious talk with Sam."